Now, last night I covered this tit-for-tat trade war between China and the US and how it's affecting all of us here in Australia. Well, a day after former Treasurer Peter Costello's warning, and it was a little bit more than a warning, I guess, that Australian retirees might be the ones to suffer, we've got another politician ringing the bell. Tim Wilson is a Liberal Party backbencher, and he's also the chair of the House of Representatives Economics Committee. Tomorrow, he'll be grilling the Reserve Bank Governor, Philip Lowe, who kept the cash rate on hold this week, as you know, at a record low of 1%. Now, Tim Wilson says that shows he's thrown up his hands and given up stimulating the economy. I think that's a fair call, but it will be very interesting to see how the Reserve Bank responds to the scrutiny and what they say about why they did what they did. I've got Tim Wilson joining me right now from Canberra. Evening, Tim.
Good evening, thanks for having me.
That's okay. All right, pretend for a second you're in the committee room right now. What questions will you be asking Philip Lowe tomorrow?
Well, there'll be many questions. I mean, my principal concern, as is with many Australians, is the basis in which they've made decisions, particularly immediately after the election, to cut interest rates twice. The understanding that they have on the impact it will have on many Australians. And one of the ones that I've raised previously is for the many Australians who depend on interest-bearing deposits for their disposable income, and particularly Australian retirees. They are socialising or floating the idea of quantitative easing, which is, you know, sort of a highfalutin way of saying basically potentially printing money, depending on how you go about it. And these are the sorts of things that I want to know the answer to. But I say respectfully, I just need to clarify that I didn't say that they had given up on monetary stimulation. I said that they had exhausted, simply by exhausted monetary stimulation, because they've cut rates to a point where there's, frankly, very little further to go, and that's not really in dispute.
Well, that's true. Let's explain that to our viewers. When something is at about 1%, if you're cutting it back to 0.5%, you can't expect more people to rush in and take advantage of the lower rates, because if they weren't doing it at 1.5, 1.25 or 1, they're not going to do it when it even gets lower, because it's almost ground zero right now, right?
Well, the reality is, for a lot of people, well, you know, 1 or 1.5%, and even when you add in sort of retail top-ups by banks where they're at 2.5 or 3%, the serviceability of being able to afford to finance the debt isn't going to move radically. If it's 7% and you're dropping down to 3%, you get you're going to get a big shift in people's behaviour. But a simple drop of 0.25% off what is already basically very cheap money isn't going to dramatically change people's behaviour.
Well, hang on a second. Aren't you arguing against what you're criticising Philip Lowe for? Maybe he's thinking the same thing, and that all of a sudden moving with monetary policy to stimulate the economy is a blunt instrument.
Well, no, I don't think I am. What I'm saying is that there are serious questions about why they've taken the decision to reduce rates further, that it gives very limited avenue for them, if there were a downturn, to take a proportionate response. They have no flexibility to do so. And in fact, what it's likely to do in this environment, and what some of their own research raises questions about, is does it just lead to people paying more for houses, taking on more debt, which actually makes it harder for them to raise rates later, because, you know, it's fine to cut rates, but you've also got to have a pathway, depending on circumstances, to increase them back up. And if everybody's just loading up on more and more debt, it actually makes it harder for them to do so. So it's the rationale and the approach that is critical. And of course, the assumption is that just cutting rates will stimulate the economy. But when you've got a lot of older Australians looking for security and got term deposits, actually cutting rates can actually harm their disposable income.
Now, the Reserve Bank in New Zealand, this is interesting. After what we didn't do on Tuesday, the Reserve Bank in New Zealand dropped 50 points yesterday when people were expecting a steady 25. So they've taken a little bit of a plunge. In banking terms, it's probably a risky plunge. What does that tell us about what we should have done on Tuesday?
Well, I think the Reserve Bank made the right decision on Tuesday to hold rates. I just question their two earlier moves downwards. But it suggests to me that New Zealand both might be in a mixture of catching up, but I think it also raises big questions for countries like Australia and like New Zealand, that we're interest rate takers, that we don't really have a choice anymore when you've got the US Reserve cutting its interest rates,
Yep.
do we really have choices? Because if they keep cutting their rates, then people are going to send their money overseas to try and find places where there's growth, and then that creates pressure on our currency, and then it makes us less competitive. And so we can't just separate ourselves out. And these are the questions that I think, as chair of the Economics Committee, I suspect many members of the committee are really going to want very strong answers to tomorrow from the Reserve Bank Governor, because do we even really have that much control over monetary policy anymore?
Good luck with the grilling.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, fantastic. Liberal MP Tim Wilson, that will